Stalin and Hitler. The first time their paths fatally crossed was in Vienna back in 1913 at an apartment on 30 Schönbrunner Strasse. From his apartment, Stalin could see the Austrian emperor's lavish ceremonial procession every day. This parade passed right below his building on its way to the Hofburg Palace. The procession was filled with Hungarian cavalry in their finest regalia, surrounding a grand and imposing carriage, drawn by 6 white horses. Inside the carriage sat the aging Habsburg emperor. His family had ruled over this land for a solid 600 years. Wherever the procession went, people would stop everything to watch, and in that crowd there was a struggling art student. His friend later recalled that Hitler was not impressed. He wasn't interested in the emperor, but rather the empire he represented. In that year, Hitler and Stalin were both just completely unknown young men. At the same time, but independently of each other, they both fixed their gaze on the emperor high above. That was the closest they would ever be in their entire lives. Later, they would become mortal enemies, yet they would never meet face to face again. By the time they knew each other's names, the monarchy had already crumbled. They clawed their way to the pinnacle of power over the bones of the former emperor. A new world war was about to break out. They no longer paid any mind to the kings. That time had cast aside. Instead, they turned their piercing gazes toward each other. Of all the great powers in World War II, the Soviet Union's starting position was one of the 2 most difficult. The Soviet Union's geographical location was not exactly ideal. Along its extensive borders were countless geopolitical conflicts. To its west were Germany and Poland. To its east was Japan. All 3 of these countries had defeated Russia in the past. And what's more, Germany and Japan were now fascist allies, leaving the Soviet Union in the terrible position of being attacked from both sides. The Soviet Union, its unique ideology, also made it a focal point on the international stage. As the only socialist country in the world, it had no allies and was in an isolated position. Meanwhile, all the countries that wanted to upend the international order loved to use anti-communism as a cover. Germany, Japan, and Italy's Anti-Comintern Pact was a product of this. As the beneficiaries of the current international order, Britain and France were also happy to see the Soviet Union clash with fascist nations. They continuously pushed an appeasement policy, hoping to divert fascist expansion toward the Soviet Union. Just like that, a loose but enormous anti-Soviet alliance began to form, constantly squeezing the Soviet Union's strategic space. In an environment like this, turning a passive situation into an active one and leading the Soviet Union out of its predicament was, you could say, next to impossible, but Stalin did it. Germany, Italy, and Japan claimed to be anti-communist, so Stalin called for an anti-fascist united front. In the Spanish Civil War, the 2 sides faced off in a proxy war. With the Soviet Union's help, more than 30,000 volunteers from 54 countries formed the international brigades and waged a resolute and courageous struggle against the fascist armies. Although the leftist alliance supported by the Soviet Union lost, the Soviet Union also proved it held a powerful appeal for the vast proletariat around the world. This was something that governments everywhere feared. As for the situation in Europe, Stalin explained his diplomatic strategy like this: to divide the imperialists, we should exploit the contradictions and conflicts between them as much as possible. The longer and more indecisive the struggle between the European nations, the more it benefits us. He wasn't in a hurry to pick a side. Instead, he took advantage of the conflict between Britain and France and Germany, the conflict between the old established powers and the new rising one. By talking to both sides at the same time, he maintained an ambiguous stance, hinting that he could side with either one at any moment. He used this to play both sides against each other. But in this process, Britain and France made a huge miscalculation. They assumed that the Soviet Union and Germany would never team up. But Stalin and Hitler were actually both very pragmatic. Anti-communism and anti-fascism were not principles they stuck to from start to finish. They could fly that banner to rally allies, and they could just as easily take it down when it was convenient. Their most fundamental guiding principle was always national interest. Britain and France also misjudged the Soviet Union's military strength. 20 years earlier, Soviet Russia had begged Germany for peace, and then Britain and France went on to defeat Germany. This mindset, held over from World War I, led Britain and France to assume they were stronger than Germany, and that Germany in turn was stronger than the Soviet Union. This series of miscalculations led Britain and France to underestimate the Soviet Union's strategic importance. So, when the Soviets proposed a united front against fascism, their response was lukewarm at best. After being snubbed by Britain and France, Stalin had no choice but to look for a breakthrough elsewhere. On the other side of the world in Asia, if a full-scale war broke out with Japan, the Soviet Union would be forced to maintain a massive army and a long supply line in the Far East. This would seriously weaken the Soviet Union's power in Europe, something Stalin wanted to avoid at all costs. A plan started to form in his mind: use China to tie down Japan. And just as he was thinking about this, Japan's top brass were fiercely debating whether to strike north or south. Stalin quickly made the choice for them with his actions. He kept sending more and more troops to the Far East. By 1935, the number of Soviet troops in the Far East had swelled to 240,000. At the time, Japan only had 80,000 troops in Manchuria and Korea. After making some comparisons, the Japanese realized that China would be an easier target than the Soviet Union, and it had more resources. Following Japan's full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the Soviet Union began providing large amounts of economic and military aid, becoming China's main foreign supporter. Of course, this aid wasn't free. Stalin wanted China to keep Japan tied down for as long as possible. As long as Japan didn't pull out of the war in China, it couldn't pose a threat to the Soviet Union. Just as Stalin was shifting his focus back to Europe, things took a dramatic turn. Germany went on to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia. The relationship between Britain, France, and Germany became extremely tense. But Hitler wasn't satisfied. He wanted Poland too. And this time he didn't go to Chamberlain, he went to Stalin. On August 20th, 1939, Hitler personally sent a telegram to Stalin, desperately trying to push through a non-aggression pact. Stalin saw this as a golden opportunity. He replied to Hitler the very same day he received the telegram, stating that their two peoples needed to live in peace. 3 days later, the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, arrived in Moscow. The two sides worked through the night and signed the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. They also drew a dividing line right across Polish territory. The left side would go to Germany and the right side to the Soviet Union. During the talks, Ribbentrop decided to liven things up a bit. He said, generally speaking, the Anti-Comintern Pact wasn't really aimed at the Soviet Union, but rather at the Western democracies. Hearing this, Stalin decided to poke fun at their mutual enemy, Great Britain. He responded knowingly, the Anti-Comintern Pact mainly just scared a bunch of British shopkeepers. Ribbentrop immediately flattered him, saying, "Mr. Stalin, of course you weren't afraid. In Berlin, we have a saying." Stalin was also going to join an international non-aggression pact. Everyone in the room burst into laughter. It was a truly bizarre scene. Everyone knew it was all just a complete lie. But they all shared a tacit understanding and just played along with the whole charade. It was a union based purely on self-interest, dressed up in the guise of friendship. Meanwhile, outside this conference room, the entire world was rocked by the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, completely stunned. On September 1st, 1939, Germany launched a blitzkrieg on Poland and the Second World War began. 16 days later, the Soviet Red Army also crossed the border. They marched mightily into Poland to occupy the territory they had failed to conquer 20 years prior. In the 2 years that followed, the Soviet Union swept across Eastern Europe, attacking Finland and annexing the 3 Baltic states. It restored the vast territory of the former Tsarist Russian Empire. From this moment on, Stalin was not only Lenin's successor, he was also the heir to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. He simultaneously embodied both Marxism-Leninism and the spirit of great power chauvinism. This combination allowed him to push the Soviet Union to an unprecedented peak. It also led him down the divergent path of revisionism. With Germany and the Soviet Union on friendly terms, Japan, of course, no longer had a reason to remain hostile to the Soviets. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was signed. The two sides promised not to attack each other. The Soviet Union would terminate its aid to China, recognize the state of Manchukuo, and transfer the Chinese Eastern Railway in northeast China to Japan. In return, Japan only needed to recognize the state of Mongolia as a Chinese person. If you asked me to evaluate the period from the Soviet-German Pact to the Soviet-Japanese Pact, I would definitely have to condemn Stalin's actions. It was the appeasement and indulgence of fascists. It was making a deal with the devil. But if you were a Soviet citizen with not much sympathy for other countries, you would probably think Stalin was a geopolitical mastermind, a cunning genius. Before the outbreak of World War II, a lot of people thought the Soviet Union would be the first to get knocked out. On the surface, every country was hostile towards them. They were surrounded by predatory enemies circling like vultures. But in just 2 short years, that situation was turned completely on its head. The Soviet Union wasn't destroyed. Instead, it rode the wave and came out with huge gains, firmly seizing the initiative. If we sum it all up, we find that when faced with the uncontrollable and highly aggressive force of fascism, the politicians of every country, their first reaction was always appeasement. Don't stop them, don't confront them head on, just let them go bite someone else. And so you had the appeasement of Japan during the September 18th incident, the appeasement of Japan in the video, the appeasement of Italy in the war in Ethiopia, and the appeasement of Germany at the Munich conference. But what was so brilliant about Stalin was that he was the only one who succeeded. The Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact allowed the Soviet Union to gain real tangible benefits. While the Munich Agreement was just a worthless piece of paper, Stalin's strategy of benefiting himself at others' expense certainly isn't praiseworthy. But compared to Chamberlain and Daladier's strategy, which hurt others without even helping themselves, his was a bit more shrewd. After France surrendered and Western Europe fell, Germany and the Soviet Union had the power to divide the entire Eurasian continent. But after Churchill came to power, Britain once again showed it had a sufficient will to resist and the ability to protect itself. Germany desperately needed the Soviet Union to send troops to attack Britain together. The two sides started negotiating again over this issue, and it was during these very negotiations that cracks began to appear in their relationship. Hitler tried to persuade the Soviet Union to join the Axis powers to carve up the British Empire's vast overseas colonies. But Stalin was more concerned about the three countries around the Soviet-German border. He demanded that Germany pull its troops out of Finland and Romania and brought up a mutual assistance pact against aggression, a promise to bring Bulgaria into the Soviet sphere of influence. But that crossed a line for Hitler. Finland and Romania were already German allies, and he wanted to keep his ally Bulgaria on his side. Hitler had always been wary of Stalin. He had no intention of letting the Soviet Union move one step further west. So he proposed that the Soviets expand in a different direction, toward Asia, toward Iran and India. Representing Hitler, the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop started painting a pretty picture. To the south, you all will finally get the access to the sea you've dreamed of for centuries, a port of your own. The Soviet foreign minister at the time, Molotov, deliberately asked him, "Which sea are you talking about?" Molotov knew exactly what was going on. The Germans only wanted to offer the Soviets a path to India. But what the Soviets really wanted was the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Mediterranean. Hitler wanted to drag us into this so we'd go fight the British, Molotov later recalled. But at the same time, he wasn't willing to make concessions on Finland and Romania. He was basically treating us like idiots. And just like that, the negotiations went nowhere. Soviet-German relations began to slide from their peak into a steep decline. What Molotov didn't realize, however, was that while he and Ribbentrop were negotiating, Hitler had already secretly issued Directive Number 18, which ordered the German army to prepare for an invasion of the Soviet Union. This move by Hitler was at first completely unexpected by everyone, including Stalin. Of course, Stalin was well aware that a war between the Soviets and the Germans was inevitable. His annexation of the Baltic states was specifically intended to create a buffer zone against Germany, but what he never expected was for the German attack to come so quickly. At the time, Britain hadn't been defeated yet. For Germany to attack the Soviet Union would mean getting bogged down in a two-front war, and America's next move was still a total mystery. They were just watching from the sidelines. It seemed like the least likely time for Germany to invade the Soviet Union. But as they say, all warfare is based on deception. He was the kind of person who would never attack when you expected him to. The more you'd never expect it, the more likely he was to do it. German military strategy and tactics were all about catching the enemy by surprise and hitting them when they were unprepared. From the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact to the Blitzkrieg and then to the surprise attack. On the Soviet Union, this pattern held true every time. In order to defeat the Soviet Union quickly, Hitler went to great lengths. He personally wrote a letter to Stalin. In it, he wrote that in order to assemble his army while avoiding enemy reconnaissance, he had massed a large number of troops on the Soviet-German border, about 80 divisions. All these rumors that our two countries are about to go to war, I swear on my honor as head of state, are completely false. Just give me one more month, and I'll move these troops from the Soviet-German border to the west. Some of my more hawkish generals, I might try to deliberately stir up trouble during this process and create a rift between us. I will do my best to stop them, but if the unfortunate happens, please maintain your composure. Don't take any action and notify me immediately. Hitler was arguably the greatest con artist of his time, and he completely fooled Stalin. As the war drew closer, more and more intelligence reports indicated that Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, but Stalin just wouldn't believe it. He wrote on one of the intelligence reports, "This is a British attempt to sow discord. Find out who sent this intel and punish them severely." 9 days before the German-Soviet war broke out, Soviet officials were still issuing denials, stating that there would be no conflict between the two nations. Even on the very day the invasion began, Stalin still hadn't seen through Hitler's deception. Even his most loyal general, Voroshilov, couldn't help but confront him. The Germans are bombing our cities. How could this possibly be a provocation? Stalin's answer was, if someone wanted to provoke a conflict between our two countries, would German generals go as far as bombing their own cities? Hitler surely knows nothing about this. However, it wasn't long before the hard, ironclad facts made Stalin realized he'd been played. Hitler didn't just know about it, he had personally planned the whole thing. This was without a doubt a resounding slap in the face that shattered Stalin's ego and pride. Regret, hatred, and shame filled Stalin's heart and changed him profoundly. He began to rein in his autocratic tendencies. He started to seriously reflect and listen to the opinions of others. As Voroshilov said before this, Stalin wasn't like this. The war truly taught him a lot. He understood that he too could make mistakes. His decisions weren't always the best. The perspectives and experience of others could be more valuable. The years had an effect on Stalin. Before the war, he was younger, overconfident, and had a rude awakening. After this wake-up call, Stalin spent day and night with his generals, beginning their search for a path forward in the dark. They had to face the full head-on assault of the entire Third Reich. And on the other side of the battlefield, Hitler was excitedly watching the war unfold. He was ecstatic to discover that the unprepared Soviet Red Army was completely powerless against the German Blitzkrieg. The same scenes that had played out in France and Poland were happening all over again. The German army advanced practically unopposed. In just 18 days, they pushed forward 600 kilometers. On the very first day, they destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft. Of those, 800 were hit before they even had a chance to take off. The German army's three fronts each achieved unbelievable victories. The Northern Front smashed 24 divisions of the Red Army. The Central Front eliminated 300,000 Red Army soldiers. And the Southern Front defeated the Soviet Union's strongest military district, the Southwestern Front, successfully wiping out 70 Soviet divisions, a full 660,000 men. Reports of the victory reached Hitler from the front lines. He proudly called it the greatest battle of annihilation in history. This was the peak of Hitler's life. He looked down on the world as if he had no equal. He was filled with confidence as he pointed his forces directly at Moscow. This scene had played out countless times before. Whenever his army approached a nation's capital, those high and mighty heads of state would either flee in chaos or bow their heads in surrender. He had no doubt that this same scene would play out again in Moscow. Before 1941, Hitler had never lost a battle on land. As the German army closed in on the city, the Soviet Union began the largest industrial relocation in history. Over 1 million freight cars of supplies and equipment were transported to the interior. Stalin's subordinates went to his side and asked if he would also evacuate to the rear. At the time, Moscow was hanging by a thread, so the suggestion was perfectly reasonable. But unexpectedly, Stalin refused the offer. He was already 63 years old, the leader of a nation. But age and status had done nothing to make him weak. His iron-like courage and will were the same as they'd always been. He wasn't just calling on the people to go to the battlefield. He bet his own life on it. If his destiny was to die for his country, then he would not run from it. Not only would he not flee, he was going to show the entire world the Soviet Union's resolve and conviction. On October 7th, 1941, Stalin walked onto the rostrum in Red Square. Beneath his feet was Lenin's mausoleum. On this day 24 years ago, he and Lenin, in October, built this nation together amid the gunfire of the revolution. And today, he had to protect everything they had fought for. Below the stage were over 20,000 Soviet Red Army soldiers, their rifles fully loaded. This was because after the review, they would head straight to the battlefield to fight. A life-or-death battle with the enemy outside Moscow. Heavy snow fell from the sky and everyone held their breath. Annihilate the German invaders. Long live our glorious motherland. Long live our freedom and independence. Under the banner of Lenin, forward to victory. Stalin's voice pierced through the heavy snow, echoing across Red Square. Answering him was a deafening roar of "Ura!" This scene was broadcast live to the entire world, from the front lines to the home front, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Dnieper River. Everyone heard the rallying cry of the Soviet Red Army. For Hitler, this was undoubtedly a huge humiliation. It was as if Stalin was pointing his finger right in his face, taunting him. I'm holding a parade in Red Square right now. If you had a single army that could fight its way into Moscow, a single plane that could fly over my head, you could kill us all. But can you? Enraged Hitler furiously ordered his bomber squadrons to take off immediately to destroy Red Square and interrupt the parade. But Zhukov had already set up anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes. The German army lost 25 bombers without managing to drop a single bomb on Red Square. The success of the Red Square parade greatly boosted the Soviet people's will to resist. Stalin's determination was also on full display. Moscow was the final line of defense. He would not retreat another step. To capture Moscow, Hitler had assembled 3 army groups, totaling 1,700,000 men. But to his surprise, he found the German advance was slowing down more and more. His army had once blitzed through every enemy defensive line, but now it was as if they had crashed into a wall of steel. Every kilometer of the way to Moscow was an excruciating struggle for the German forces. On the other side, facing Hitler, Stalin was making a series of preparations. He appointed Zhukov to command the Western Front, establishing multiple defensive lines around Moscow. Every major approach was held by a battle-hardened general. After confirming that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union, elite Soviet divisions from the Far East were also rushed to Moscow. The residents of Moscow, including women and children, were all mobilized. They dug over 700 kilometers of anti-tank ditches and formed 169 street fighting units. From the generals to the soldiers, from the leaders to the people, every single person in Moscow was on high alert, ready to fight to the death. Faced with such an enemy, Hitler's prized German war machine finally stalled out. At their closest, they were only 22.8 kilometers from the Red Square. Moscow was right before their eyes, but they couldn't advance a single step further. And just as they halted, the Soviet Red Army sounded the charge for their counteroffensive. The Red Army pushed the front line back 350 kilometers, inflicting 500,000 casualties on the German army. From that moment on, the Soviet Red Army, with Moscow as its starting point and Berlin as its destination, began the greatest march of World War II. The fruits of Stalin's earlier industrialization began to show. T-34 tanks, PPSH submachine guns, Katyusha rocket launchers. A steady stream of these excellent weapons flowed from the factories to the front lines. Stalin countered their tide of steel with one of his own. His generals, too, were figuring out and developed a strategy suitable for the Soviet Union. A theory of mass warfare. The Red Army had by then formed a systematic and complete strategic and organizational structure. They annihilated countless German soldiers on the battlefield. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Stalingrad to Operation Barbarossa, Hitler could only watch helplessly as his armies were defeated one after another. His anger and resentment, his ambition and grand plans all came to nothing. On April 30th, 1945, less than 4 years after the Battle of Moscow, the Soviet Red Army raised the red flag over the Reichstag building in Berlin. It was also on this day that Hitler ended his own life with a pistol. With the sound of a single gunshot, the Nazi Empire came crashing down. After World War II ended, Stalin, now old, was still active on the political stage, but he found his strength increasingly failing him. His subordinates, like Khrushchev and Beria, were already secretly showing their disgust and contempt for him. They were just waiting for the day the old man would fall. In the last few years of his life, Stalin often stayed at his villa by the Black Sea. He liked to sit on the balcony with friends, looking out at the calm sea, reminiscing about the past 70 years. In his youth, he had written a poem, Ninika from the Old District. The poem described the twilight years of a hero. Later, he became that Ninika. The poem captured the hero's youth and the hero's final days. Stalin looked back on his past, and it all seemed like a dream. He fell with a crash like a giant. After his death, they only found some clothes in his home. But outside his home, he left behind a red superpower, a socialist bloc powerful enough to rival the West. Let future generations praise or condemn me. History will be my judge. And that's the main content of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to keep going.